right. So today we're diving into this pretty wild legal case. It's a story about free speech and racketeering and those book royalties that I think we all kind of dream of.
Oh, yeah.
But this one centers on a name you'll probably recognize. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's Sammy the Bull, the Gambino family underboss.
Right.
Who famously flipped on John Gotti.
Yeah, his story's already got more twists and turns than like a mob movie, right? But it gets even crazier.
Oh, yeah.
So after he serves time for his RHU conviction, Gravano ends up in Arizona.
Oh, wow.
Running an ecstasy ring.
Okay, so not exactly retired and living the quiet life.
I got quiet. And get this, Arizona doesn't just go after his drug money.
No.
They set their sights on something way more interesting. The profits from his autobiography, Underboss.
Oh, wow.
So that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Okay.
Our main source for this deep dive is a 2003 Arizona Court of Appeals ruling that really grapples with this question. Can the government actually seize profits from a book, even if the book itself is totally legal?
Yeah, where's that line between free speech and ill-gotten gains? I mean, that's
It's a fascinating question
Yeah.
because we're not just talking about grabbing existing cash here.
right.
Arizona wanted any future profits from Underboss, essentially saying Gravano couldn't benefit from his notoriety even years later.
Wow, so they're going after potential future earnings, not even just what he had
Exactly.
at the time.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so to understand how we even got to this point, I think we need to go back to 1991
Okay.
and Gravano's RUCO conviction in New York.
Right.
This wasn't just like some petty crime spree or anything.
Yep.
We're talking serious offenses here.
Yeah.
Murder, extortion, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, you got to have that context because the Arizona court really looked at his violent past when deciding if those book profits were basically a result of his criminal activities.
Right.
I mean, think about it this way. Would anyone be clamoring to read a book by, like, Sammy the accountant?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. I think New York actually had this law called the Son of Sam law.
right.
And it was aimed at preventing criminals from profiting off their crimes by like writing books or making movies about it. But it didn't actually apply to Gravano
Really? Why not?
because his conviction was federal, not state.
Oh, interesting. So that leaves the door open for Arizona to step in with their own approach,
Okay.
which we'll see is quite different.
Okay.
So fast forward to 2000, Gravano gets arrested in Arizona,
Okay.
and they hit him with their racketeering and forfeiture laws.
Okay. But like we said, they don't just go after his money.
Right.
They target any potential future benefits from underboss.
Mm-hmm.
And Gravano fights back hard. He's saying this is like a direct attack on his First Amendment rights.
Yeah, I mean,
His argument.
they're punishing him for the content of his speech.
And that's where this whole legal battle really gets going.
Yeah.
Boils down to Gravano saying, hey, I wrote a book and you're taking my money because you don't like what I said.
Right. But Arizona's claiming their laws are content neutral.
Content neutral. Okay, so what does that actually mean in this context, though?
Well, it means that the law itself doesn't target specific opinions
Right.
or viewpoints,
Right.
but it might have this like side effect of impacting someone's speech. It's a tricky concept.
It is, yeah.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Imagine someone could just seize your blog income
Oh, wow.
because of something unrelated you did like years ago.
Yeah.
Suddenly it hits a little closer to home.
Yeah, that's a little unsettling, for
Yeah,
sure.
Right.
So, okay, if Arizona's laws are supposed to be content neutral, how do they justify going after Gravano's book profits then?
Well, they had a few main points.
Okay.
First, deterring crime, obviously,
Makes sense.
compensating victims,
Okay.
and preventing criminals from profiting, period.
Okay.
Their argument was that these goals are content neutral.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you made money from a business or whatever.
Right.
If it's tied to illegal activity, they can go after it.
Okay. But they go even further. They do. With this thing called a but-for test of causation.
Oh, yeah.
Essentially saying Gravano wouldn't even have a book deal but for his criminal notoriety.
Yeah.
Is what made the book sellable.
Exactly. I mean, you don't see too many reformed mob bosses writing romance novels under a pseudonym, do you?
That's true.
His whole persona, his brand, if you will, was built on being Sammy the Bull.
Underboss isn't even just about crime. It's filled with details of the crimes.
Yeah, the content is tied to his past.
Yeah, it's like inherently tied to his past.
Which raises a point that might be interesting for you. Think about true crime podcasts
Yeah.
or documentaries.
Yeah.
They're profiting in a way from stories of wrongdoing, too.
Yeah.
Does that make them exploitative?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
We could probably do a whole other deep dive on that.
We could.
But for now, let's get back to Gravano.
All right.
One of his arguments was that Arizona had no right to take his money because his crimes happened in New York.
Oh, so he's saying they were overstepping, trying to punish him for crimes committed somewhere else.
Yeah, essentially, what did Arizona have to do with it?
Well, Arizona saw it differently.
Okay.
They argued that organized crime is a nationwide problem,
Right.
and that stopping criminals from enjoying their profits no matter where they are serves a broader purpose.
Right. It's like you can't just move to a new state and expect a clean slate when it comes to profiting off your past.
Exactly, especially if those profits are tied to your crimes.
Right. And we can't forget that Arizona also has an interest in protecting their own residents even from criminals who came from out of state.
Of course.
So their argument seems pretty solid so far. But Gravano also claimed that Arizona's law was way too broad.
Okay.
Like he said it was basically just a rebranded Son of Sam law.
Yeah, which the Supreme Court had already struck down.
Exactly.
Huh?
So how did Arizona respond to that?
Well, they pointed out some key differences.
Okay.
Their law was more specific.
Okay.
It targeted proceeds that were directly traceable to racketeering.
So not just any mention of a crime in any book.
Exactly. It was about the source of the profits.
Not about censorship.
Precisely. And also, Arizona's law had these built-in protections to make sure there was due process.
Okay.
They couldn't just take Gravano's money.
Right.
They had to prove their case in court.
Right. It wasn't a free-for-all on anyone who just happened to mention a crime in their work.
Right.
But hold on, there's one last piece of this puzzle we got to understand before we can see how this all played out.
Yeah.
Jurisdiction. How did Arizona courts even have the authority to rule on this in the first place?
That's where it gets a little technical.
Okay.
But it comes down to a few things.
Okay.
First, Gravano was living in Arizona at the time.
Okay.
Second, those royalties were being held in Arizona at his request.
Gotcha.
And third, intangible things like contract rights
Okay.
are generally considered to be located where the owner lives.
So basically, even though his crimes were in New York, his Arizona residency gave them jurisdiction. So they had him right where they needed him to apply their laws.
They did.
But did they actually manage to get his book money in the end?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, in the end, they did. The court upheld that forfeiture of Gravano's royalties. It was a big win for Arizona.
Yeah.
And it really set a precedent for anyone looking to profit off a criminal past.
It kind of makes you think, though, this case really shows that constant push and pull between individual expression, even about a criminal past,
Right.
and society's interest in making sure crime doesn't actually pay.
Absolutely. And it's not even just about the money itself. It's about the potential for fame,
Yeah.
for turning a criminal lifestyle into something almost glamorous or aspirational.
Exactly.
This ruling forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
Like the fact that our own fascination with true crime can sometimes benefit the very people who committed the crimes.
Right. Let's be honest. Underboss probably wouldn't have been nearly as popular if it was written by, like, I don't know, a retired librarian.
Probably not.
It was Gravano's notoriety
Yeah.
that drew people in.
That's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
His past is what made his story so compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what Arizona was aiming to penalize.
But then that raises some other questions, too. Are we saying that anyone who's committed a crime can never write about their experiences?
Right.
What about redemption? Couldn't these stories actually serve as cautionary tales?
Those are all really valid points. It's crucial to understand that the court wasn't making some like hard and fast rule here.
Right.
They made a specific decision
Okay.
based on Gravano and his case.
Right. And they focused on that direct connection between his racketeering and the actual content of Underboss.
Right. It wasn't some casual mention. It was
Yeah.
the core of the book.
So that suggests that there might be situations where someone could write about your past without getting into the same legal hot water.
Potentially. Yeah.
Like, what if a former criminal wrote a fictional novel that's inspired by their experiences but not directly profiting from the crimes?
It's possible.
Okay.
Of course, each case is going to be judged on its own merits.
Right.
And there's always room for different legal interpretations.
Of course, we're not lawyers here.
Right.
But this case definitely set a precedent, at least in Arizona,
Yeah.
for how courts view profits connected to stories about criminal past.
Absolutely. And it has implications beyond just book royalties, too.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Think about movie rights.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking engagements.
Yeah.
Even merchandise.
Okay, so basically, any way someone could profit from their notoriety that's tied to their criminal activities could be subject to forfeiture.
Exactly.
Wow.
This ruling probably made a lot of true crime creators rethink their approach.
I bet.
But there's another group we haven't really talked about yet. The victims.
Oh, yeah. Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, remember, one of Arizona's main goals was to compensate victims. And they pointed out that Gravano's book basically glorifying his crimes could be really painful for the people he actually harmed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It shifts the focus away from Gravano's free speech.
Right.
And toward the victim's right to justice and healing.
Exactly.
It also brings up the question about the ethics of profiting off of stories that involve real victims. Is it ever okay to turn someone else's suffering into entertainment or financial gain?
That's something we as a society really need to grapple with.
Especially because these lines are getting blurrier and blurrier.
They are.
I mean, true crime is everywhere these days. Books, movies, podcasts, documentaries.
And while a lot of those are trying to shed light on important issues, there's always a risk of exploitation, of sensationalizing violence, of reducing complex human stories to just entertainment.
It is a fine line to walk, for sure.
Yeah.
This case really highlights how our interest in true crime can sometimes come at a cost.
It challenges us to think about who benefits from these stories and who might be harmed.
And it reminds us that even something as fundamental as freedom of speech isn't absolute.
Yeah.
There are limits.
There are.
Especially when it comes to profiting off criminal activity.
And those limits are constantly evolving as society changes. And we kind of rethink what justice and accountability really mean.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener?
Right. What can you take away from this?
Okay.
Well, I think it means being a more aware consumer of true crime.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, where are those profits going? Are the victims being treated respectfully?
Think about that ethical side of turning real-life tragedies into entertainment.
Right.
Is it being done responsibly?
Is it giving a voice to the victims?
Yeah.
Or just exploiting their pain?
And recognize that freedom of speech can sometimes bump up against the pursuit of justice.
It's true.
This case might have been decided back in 2003. But the questions it raises are more relevant than ever.
Absolutely. Especially in a world where true crime is everywhere you look.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The stories we tell and how we profit from them have real consequences.
Yeah.
And those consequences ripple outward far beyond any courtroom.
You know, before we wrap up, I want to touch on something we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
That whole question of jurisdiction.
Okay.
It might seem like a technicality.
Yeah.
But it was really key to the outcome of this case.
It was. The fact that Gravano was in Arizona and his royalties were being held there.
Right.
That gave those courts the authority to apply their laws.
We're not just talking about physical property either. It's intangible things like contract rights. And those rights are usually thought of as existing where the owner lives.
So even though his crimes were in New York, his Arizona residency gave them jurisdiction.
Exactly.
It's like you can't just move to a new state and totally outrun your past.
Right. It really speaks to how far-reaching these laws can be. And the commitment to stopping criminals from benefiting from their crimes, regardless of where the money comes from.
So just to bring it all together, the court decided that Gravano's book profits were essentially fruits of his illegal activities, and they were justified in seizing them.
And that ruling sent a strong message, not just for criminals who write books, but for anyone who tries to profit from past wrongdoing.
It really makes you think about, okay, so we've gone through all the legal stuff and the precedents and even some of those ethical questions. But this case really gets down to one basic question, doesn't it?
It does.
Where do we draw the line?
Exactly. Should anyone be allowed to profit from their past, even indirectly?
Yeah.
And what about the people they hurt? How do we make sure their voices are heard?
It's easy to get caught up in, the excitement of a true crime story.
Oh, yeah.
But this case reminds us there are real people involved.
Absolutely.
Real consequences behind those stories.
And I think as consumers of true crime, we have to be more aware. Think about where the money's going.
Right.
Are the victims being treated with respect?
Is the story being told responsibly?
Exactly. Is it shedding light on injustice? Or is it just exploiting their pain for entertainment?
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is.
We want to protect free speech.
Right.
But we also want to make sure justice is served. And that victims aren't forgotten.
This case might seem unique.
Yeah.
But it really shows this bigger problem, this relationship between free speech, the pursuit of justice, and our fascination with true crime.
And those lines are only going to get blurrier.
Oh, yeah.
With technology and more stories being shared.
We have to be careful about how we engage with those narratives. Think about the impact they can have on people and society as a whole.
So as we finish up this deep dive,
yeah,
we hope we've given you some things to think about.
I hope so.
This wasn't just about a mobster and his book.
It was about a much bigger conversation we have to have as a society.
It's about expression and accountability.
Right.
Entertainment and ethics.
And I think that's a conversation we all need to be part of.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time for another one.